In this lesson, we'll examine the strategy for tackling assumption questions on the GMAT. These questions present us with an argument, and the answer choices consist of possible assumptions. Your job is to identify an unstated assumption that is necessary for the conclusion to follow from the premises. Now, how do we recognize an assumption question? Well, as with all critical reasoning questions, we read the question stem first. Some examples of question stems that would accompany an assumption question include the following. Which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? The scientist's argument depends on the assumption that, and the conclusion above follows logically if which of the following is assumed. As you can see, assumption questions typically contain the word assume or assumption. Okay, so now that we know how to recognize assumption questions, let's learn how to tackle them. Well, since this question type is all about finding assumptions that are necessary to help us arrive at a given conclusion, our first step is to identify and summarize the conclusion. From here, the next step is to summarize the premises that support the conclusion. Please note that steps 1 and 2 can be performed at the same time. Okay, so once we've summarized the entire argument, we should attempt to identify some unstated assumptions. You will find that sometimes it's easy to identify assumptions, and sometimes it's almost impossible to identify them. Now, if you're unable to identify an assumption, it's not really a problem, because one of the strategies we'll learn later on allows us to identify the correct answer, even if we were unable to identify any assumptions in the first place. I say this to highlight the fact that, although it's advantageous to identify the assumptions in an argument, it's not necessarily required in order to help us arrive at the correct answer. So, give yourself some time to identify assumptions, but don't spend too much time doing so. Okay, once we've tried to identify one or more assumptions, our next step is to check the answer choices, looking for one of the assumptions that we identified, if we were in fact able to identify some assumptions. In addition to looking for one of the assumptions that we identified, we should also check each answer choice in terms of its effect on the conclusion. So, for example, if the conclusion of the argument is that hot dogs are bad for one's health, then as we check each answer choice, we'll keep asking, is this assumption necessary to draw the conclusion that hot dogs are bad for one's health? Is this assumption necessary to draw the conclusion that hot dogs are bad for one's health? And so on. Now at this point, the strategy for assumption questions is quite similar to the strategy for strengthen the argument questions. This should make sense, because we inevitably strengthen an argument when we state any unstated assumptions. However, there is a very important difference between strengthen the argument questions and assumption questions. In strengthen the argument questions, we're looking for additional information that helps the conclusion follow from the premises, but this information need not be an absolute necessity for the conclusion to be drawn. In assumption questions, we're looking for additional information that is absolutely necessary for the conclusion to follow from the premises. We can use this fact about assumption questions to help us add a very powerful tool to our strategy. We call this tool the negation technique. Here's how it works. First, recognize that an assumption is something that is absolutely necessary for an argument to be valid. In other words, we need that assumption to be true in order to draw the conclusion. So what happens if we take a required assumption and negate it? In other words, we make that assumption not true. Well, since the argument needs that assumption to be true, the negated assumption will destroy the argument. Consider this example. Juan has been practicing tennis 3 hours each day for the past 2 years. Therefore, Juan will win the city championship next month. Okay, let's first summarize the premise and the conclusion as follows. As you can see, several assumptions are necessary for the conclusion to follow here. A very basic assumption is that Juan will live until the city championship. Another assumption is that nothing will prevent the championship from occurring. Another assumption is that Juan is eligible to play in the championship, and so on. Okay, now let's examine what happens when we take one of these necessary assumptions and negate it. Let's negate the assumption that Juan lives until the championship. So we'll move that assumption down here first. Now, the easiest way to negate an assumption is to place the words "it is not the case that" in front of the assumption. When we do this, we get the negated assumption, "it is not the case that Juan lives until the championship." In other words, Juan dies before the championship. Now notice what happens when we insert the negated assumption into the argument as a premise. Well, if Juan dies before the championship, there is no way that he can win the championship. So when we add the negated assumption to the argument, it destroys the conclusion. Since the negated assumption destroys the conclusion, we must need the original assumption to be true. As such, we can see that this assumption is absolutely necessary for the conclusion to follow from the premises. Okay, so all of this lays the foundation for the sixth step of our strategy, which is to apply the negation technique. That is, negate each answer choice and insert it into the argument. The negated answer choice that destroys the argument the most will be the correct answer. Now, I should mention that since the negation technique can be quite time-consuming, it's a good idea to eliminate as many answer choices as possible before you apply this technique to the remaining answer choices. Okay, the final step in the assumption question strategy is to remember to check all of the answer choices. Okay, so that's the strategy for tackling assumption questions. Now let's examine some additional tips to consider. First, as you're reading the argument, determine whether it's one of the common argument types we examined earlier, and recall the assumptions associated with those types of arguments. Next, when looking for the assumptions in an argument, look for shifts in language between the premises and the conclusion. If the premises are talking about one thing, and then the conclusion introduces a whole new concept, then the conclusion probably got there by way of an assumption. Consider this example. The price of gold is expected to increase 20% this year. Therefore, the price of jewelry will increase 20% this year. Here the premise is about gold, but the conclusion doesn't even mention gold. Instead, the conclusion is about jewelry. So there must be an assumption that bridges the gap between gold and jewelry. One assumption might be something like, jewelry contains gold. So as you're reading an argument, be aware of any conclusion that introduces an idea that was not mentioned in the premises. This could indicate an unstated assumption. Finally, it's important to remember that arguments can have any number of assumptions. So just because you're able to identify a valid assumption doesn't mean that you will find that assumption among the answer choices. For example, in the argument about Juan winning the championship, you might identify an assumption as Juan is eligible to participate in the championship. While this is a necessary assumption, there are other assumptions that could also be the correct answer. So the goal with assumption questions is not to find the one assumption. The goal is to find an assumption. Although the assumption that you may find may be a crucial assumption, it's still possible that you will not find it among the answer choices. Alright, so those are the additional tips to consider. Now let's summarize. In this lesson, we learned the strategy for solving assumption questions.